Hi, Phil Swift here for
The Lord of the Rings, the card game.
the super strong
Customizable card game.
that can instantly patch, bond, seal, and repair.
LOTR LCG
Is no ordinary
card game. Its variety of quests and mechanisms
virtually welds itself
to your table,
instantly.
having you play it again. Formulaic games can cause major headaches. But LOTR LCG
Grips on tight and bonds instantly. Plus,
The Lord of the Rings, the card game's core mechanism
is so strong, it even
works on your wallet. Not all tabletop games get to experience their prime. What begin as boxes full of potential meet their demise as boxes full of regret. And to find games that suffered that fate, you need not look far. In the Fantasy Flight Games catalog alone, for every Lord of the Rings a card game, a Lord of the Rings Journeys in Middle-earth. For every Descent Journeys in the Dark, you will get a Battle Lore 2nd edition. But while some games were saying,
I could have been a contender. I could have been somebody.
the Lord of the Rings the card game was busy becoming
the greatest modern card game.
I'm Jackson Moorfield, and today we're going to look back on the prime that the Lord of the Rings the card game had, which in my mind began in late 2013 with the release of the Black Riders Saga expansion and lasted until 2018. Like Uncle Rico, we're going to relive the time when you committed so many characters to the quest that you could have punted an enemy a quarter mile. So get huddled under a tree root, grab a meat fork, because today for 11Zs, we're tasting some prime rings.
A day may come when the courage of men fails, but it is not this day. This day we fight.
If you'd like to support the channel, I now have product affiliate links in the description. So if you want to get into Lord of the Rings the card game or expand your collection, right there. As I mentioned, the prime of the Lord of the Rings the card game begins with the release of the Black Riders. September 2013's release was the beginning of the Lord of the Rings saga, where the game designers took what they learned with the Hobbit saga and adapted it to the Lord of the Rings story. Obviously, the Lord of the Rings is the main story of the Lord of the Rings, so this was a big deal, and they did a good job with it. The quests of the Black Riders were A Shadow of the Past, A Knife in the Dark, and Flight to the Ford. These quests did a good job of replicating what the Fellowship of the Ring story was like. The game didn't just artistically evoke the lore of Lord of the Rings, it did it mechanically as well, as you were playing with Hobbit heroes, and this box was the absolute best box for getting started with Hobbit decks. The box featured the Hobbits we know and love from the Lord of the Rings movies as its heroes. Frodo Baggins, Sam Gamgee, Merry, Pippin, and Fatty Bolger, some of the most famous characters of Lord of the Rings. Frodo was the Fellowship Sphere hero. So with the Black Riders, you did not have the Baggins Sphere, although I guess in theory they could have gone with the Baggins Sphere because Frodo is Frodo Baggins, but the orange sphere here is the Fellowship Sphere. The Fellowship Sphere card of the Black Riders was the Fellowship of the Ring, which was a necessarily strong card, and all of the Frodo characters had a similar ability where you exhausted the one ring card, that's an objective card, and spent one of the resources from Frodo. And for this Frodo, for doing so, you got to cancel the effects of an encounter card revealed by the encounter deck. If you wanted to build Hobbit decks and not necessarily play them within the Lord of the Rings campaign, Sam Gamgee, Merry, and Pippin were all solid cards. Honestly, all solid cards. Fatty Bolger, a little bit less so. Fatty Bolger, I guess, was a bit of a throw-in to get them up to 4 non-Fellowship Sphere heroes. But these Hobbits all had their specialties. Sam Gamgee went very well with Bill the Pony. Merry was your Hobbit attacker, and you would often equip him with the Dagger of Westerness. Pippin enhanced your ability to play Hobbit decks because Hobbit often would go well with Secrecy decks, where you would get bonuses for keeping your threat below 20. By increasing the engagement cost of the enemies that you're dealing with, you would avoid having to engage enemies when you're playing through the quest. This was a big deal, and this actually fits very thematically with the Fellowship of the Ring, as the Hobbits spent most of the time avoiding the Nazgul as opposed to fighting them directly. Because the Black Riders was such a good box, it was a very popular one. It would often be the box recommended for new players after they got the core set. As a result, the first boons you got to choose from, Mr. Underhill and Gildor and Glorian, amounted to a famous choice. Most people would go with Mr. Underhill as their boon of preference, even though Gildor's card is very strong. For those not familiar with the books of Lord of the Rings, Gildor and Glorian is actually featured early on in the Fellowship of the Ring, as the hobbits would pass by a troop of elves early on in their journey. Fans of the book would also appreciate that about a year after the release of the Black Riders, the Gen Con and Fellowship expansions for the game would add to the Lord of the Rings saga. You had the Old Forest, which is the Gen Con expansion, and Fog on the Barrow Downs, which is the Fellowship expansion. These are areas of the Fellowship of the Ring story that were not heavily explored, if at all, in the movies, but were actually significant parts of the book. Actually, a lot happens in Fellowship of the Ring that is not mentioned in the movies. The Old Forest is where Tom Bombadil comes into play. Again, not in the movies. The Old Forest will remind movie viewers, though, of Fangorn, as the Huorns, such as Old Man Willow, were somewhat of living trees. Even though Old Man Willow is not a Huorn enemy, that's kind of what they are. Fog on the Barrow Downs is actually a fairly intense area of the story where the hobbits go past the Barrow Downs, which is an area, effectively graves, where you had Barrow Wights, which are what the guy on the cover is there, popping out to fight you. Now, Tom Bombadil comes to save the day in the books, and obviously going through the campaign there. The question is whether or not you're able to use him to do the same effect. The reason why these were optional quests in the campaign, see how their Lord of the Rings parts are 1.1 and 1.2, is because actually a month before these were released, you had the second saga expansion for the Lord of the Rings in The Road Darkens, which covers the rest of the Fellowship of the Ring book and movie. Specific timing of the ending of Fellowship of the Ring versus beginning of Two Towers notwithstanding. This would be the final time the card game ventured through that same area of the Watcher in the Water at the Gates of Moria, followed by a fight with the Balrog, Durin's Bane. Well, not quite as famous as the Black Riders, and it wouldn't be because it's the sequel to the Black Riders. The Road Darkens was also a very solid box. They had another Frodo Baggins hero, so we're 2 for 2 on Frodo Baggins heroes so far in the Fellowship sphere. This Frodo used the ring to survive attacks as opposed to avoiding counterattacks, which is actually also thematic with where they were in the story. Unlike the Black Riders, the Road Darkens only came with one hero. That was Gandalf. And Gandalf would go down as being the highest threat cost hero in any expansion for Lord of the Rings, the card game, and he earns it. When you play with Gandalf, you play with the top card of your deck face up. He is an excellent card to pair with cards like Elrond, who can play the top card of the deck for free once he gets Filia. A Gandalf and Elrond deck will have a starting threat number of 27, even though it only uses 2 heroes, but that still is a strong deck, all things considered. It was one of the few times in the game's life where you would consider going with less than 3 heroes because just the third hero would send your threat up almost up to 40, depending on who you pick. The Road Darkens came with several strong allies. Galadriel and Elrond were strong, but then would also leave play after a turn, similar to Corset Gandalf. Boromir and Bilbo Baggins were also strong, but would stick around, which is a reminder that I should say that Gandalf had to be strong, because otherwise no one was going to use Gandalf as a card, because the Gandalf ally from the Corset is one of the strongest cards in the game, and if you had Hero Gandalf, you would never be able to play Ally Gandalf, as he's a unique character. Gandalf also has a number of attachment cards, such as Gandalf's Staff, and what's effectively his card is Wizard Pipe. They help set up getting that top card of your deck and get it into play. To list at this point, now you have Aragorn decks, Gandalf decks, Glorfindel and Elrond somewhat have their own decks. There wouldn't be many characters that got their own entire archetypes, but Gandalf was one of them. And even if his decks weren't the most effective in the history of the game, they were fun to play. The Lord of the Rings saga wasn't the only new trend starting at the end of 2013. Actually, a month earlier, in August of 2013, the first Nightmare decks were released. Lord of the Rings, the card game, always had a mix of players. You had players that wanted more of a thematic experience, and they were going to spend a little bit of time in deck construction, but weren't the types of players that would get enjoyment from very heavy, very complex and intense deck construction for difficult quests. On the other side of the coin, you did have players that wanted as much of a challenge as possible. Nightmare decks were for those players. We see here what the Nightmare decks did was make some of the existing quests, which are already, in some cases, a challenge, and make them even more of a challenge. But it wasn't just that. You see, Nightmare decks gave the designers a chance to fix arguably broken quests from the past. The Hills of Emmamuil, for example, was one of the least fun quests in the game's history with the way it used locations, and the Nightmare deck was a chance to somewhat fix that. Create a card, a tunneling nameless thing, where it actually looked like some of the giant creatures from the Hobbit movies. One of the best examples of this was the conflict at the Carrack. As popular as that expansion was, once you played the quest a few times, you pretty much had that quest figured out. You knew what order you had to attack the different trolls, and it no longer became a challenge. The Nightmare deck allowed the designers to remake that quest and make it a little bit more exciting so that you could go back and have an interesting challenge even after beating it the first and second time. Nightmare decks would persist throughout the prime of the game, and the last Nightmare decks would end up being released around the time the prime ended, which was in 2018. Nightmare decks would tend to be released 2 years after the initial release of the various expansions, so not all expansions got Nightmare decks. The last expansions to get the Nightmare deck treatment were the Dream Chaser cycle expansions, the Sea of Corsairs being the last one in 2018. We'll obviously get to the Grey Havens and the Dream Chaser cycle later on in this video. This is a busy time for Lord of the Rings, the card game, because in the middle of the Saga expansion, in the middle of the green boxes of the Saga expansion, that is the Fellowship of the Ring boxes, you had the start of the 2014 cycle, which was the Voice of Isengard Deluxe expansion and the following Ringmaker cycle. The Voice of Isengard's quests were the Fords of Isen to catch an orc, where you go to catch the orc Mugosh, and into Fangorn. So you're in and around Isengard, Fangorn Forest, and Northern Rohan. You're also spending a lot of time in Dunland, which is an area not heavily touched on in the movies, but is a bit to the northwest of Isengard and Rohan. That's where the Dunland tribesmen that you see here were the main enemies. It was an interesting variety. It was a type of enemy you not see of much before. The Ringmaker refers to Celebrimbor, who at the time was not known for being a character in Rings of Power, as that show wouldn't be released for another 8 or 9 years. But what did come out in 2014 was the Shadow of Mordor video game, which also featured Celebrimbor fairly heavily. Quick controversial take. I think the Shadow of Mordor and Shadow of War video games take place in a similar space as Lord of the card game, as non-canonical, but not in violation of the main canon of Middle-earth and of Tolkien's universe. I think you could have made a Talion card, Talion being the protagonist of the Shadow of Mordor video game, and put him in Lord of the card game, and it wouldn't have been jarring at all. I actually think that would have been kind of cool. Obviously, that never happened, and some people might be just covering their ears with that suggestion, but that's my take. One of my favorite quests from this series was the Three Trials, which features some pretty cool enemies: the Boar's Guardian, the Raven's Guardian, and the Wolf's Guardian. Seem to be straight out of the game Blood Rage, almost. I don't think there's a Boar clan there, but I think you do have Wolf and Raven. The main quest mechanic that was developed in the Ringmaker cycle was the timed mechanic. This was a time when the designers were realizing ways that the game itself had flaws or loopholes to playing the game. For example, the fact that you did not typically have a hand limit in any scenarios meant that you could have 20 cards in your hand. You feel cheap doing that as a player, and it's not that fun to have to choose between 20 cards. It feels like the game's a little bit broken. So the designers would release quests that would enforce hand limits. The timed mechanic, which was first seen in the Voice of Isengard and Ringmaker cycle, at least first seen used heavily, forced you to move forward in quests after only a handful of turns, as a notable strategy at the time was to intentionally go slowly in quests, thus building up a larger board state, biding your time to build up a strong team before you entered the final phases of quests, which was a little bit out of the spirit of the game, and thus the designers didn't want to encourage that. While a time mechanic was a little bit on the nose at the time, it was the first instance of this mechanic, which would come back later in the game and was a way to both add theme and control to the actual scenarios of the game. As you can see from the heroes of the Voice of Isengard and the Ringmaker cycle, Rohan got some additional firepower here. You had Éomer and Grima and Erkenbrand later on. Grima was perhaps the most interesting hero of this cycle, as he was an Isengard hero, first of all, so he's really thought of as more of an Isengard hero than Rohan. This is one of the examples of where you're playing with what's clearly a bad guy from the story. Is like Denethor, but even more so. So it was a little bit strange, a lot of people playing with Grima, and some people may not have wanted to play with Grima simply because
I told you to take the wizard's staff!
he was revealed to be a villain within the story of the Two Towers. But Grima was a card to use if you wanted to lean into one of the new player card mechanics, which was the Doomed mechanic. This is a mechanic where you could increase your threat as a way to decrease the cost to play cards. The Saruman ally was the best example of a card that did this. So you see, Saruman was extremely powerful and only cost 3 resources to get into play, but at Doomed 3, he would increase everyone's threat by 3 when he entered play. The Doomed mechanic being on player cards is one of my favorite thematic implementations of the game, whereas, yeah, you could use Saruman and Grima as quote-unquote good guys, but there is a price to doing so, and you could argue that it's a bit of a trap, and you're going to hit your 50 threat marker sooner and actually lose as a way of them almost turning on you. This cycle also had the vast majority of the Sylvan cards that would eventually be in the Elves of Lorien expansion. You had Celeborn, Haldir, and Galadriel. Celeborn and Haldir are the Sylvan elves. Galadriel is a Noldor elf, and Noldor cards would have to wait another cycle or two before that archetype got fully built out. But the Sylvan deck was built around allies entering play and leaving play, and often doing so by direct card effect and not necessarily by spending resources. At the very least, these cards would often get bonuses on the turn they entered play, so you got big bonuses when the elves would show up, and often they would just leave, which is also kind of a thing that elves do. Idrain and Mablung didn't fit into the main archetypes of this cycle, but will fit very well with the cards that came out with the Lost Realm and the Angmar Awakened cycle, which we will get to when we get to the 2015. But before we do that, I want to first mention this was also the first time we saw end cards. Treebeard was an ally that could pay for end cards, and the Booming Ent here is one of the first Ent allies that was released for the game. Ents would enter play exhausted, but to make up for that, they would be very powerful, which makes sense given how slow Ents are.
Takes a long time to say anything in all Entish.
This wouldn't be the last of the Ents, far from it, as in April of 2015, we would see the next installment of the Lord of the Rings saga, the Two Towers expansions of the Treason of Saruman and the Land of Shadow. The narrative of the Two Towers splits into two main stories. You have the Treason of Saruman side, where you have the three hunters, Aragorn, Gimli, and Legolas, and going through their adventures through Rohan and helping fight Isengard.
Legolas, what do your elf eyes see? The Uruk's turn northeast.
Meanwhile, Frodo, Sam, and Gollum will be continuing the quest to destroy the ring. Saying Gollum was on that particular aspect of the quest might not be totally true, but these expansions, narratively speaking, were taking place at the same time. For the Treason of Saruman, the quest first took you through Isengard as Aragorn, Gimli, and Legolas were first tracking the Uruk-hai through Rohan, eventually bringing them to Edoras, where they would meet Theoden and defend Helm's Deep from the invading army of Isengard. Upon victory, he moved off to Isengard to then take down Orthanc and Saruman with the help of the Ents. I appreciate the fact that the fortress here was referred to as the Hornburg, because that's actually what the fortress is called. Saruman also functioned as somewhat of a boss battle. All the saga expansions had at least one boss-type character you had to fight. In the Black Riders, it was the Witch King at Weathertop. In the Road Darkens, you had Durin's Bane, or the Balrog, and the Watcher in the Water. In the Treason of Saruman, it's basically Saruman. Now, you saw the beginning of three Hunters decks here. You had Gimli and Legolas released as allies. They're obviously already released as heroes in the core set, but they were fairly effective here as allies as well. In fact, at 4 cost, they actually provide good values for 4 cost. You can tell that the designers wanted you to use Gimli and Legolas while you could. The Spirit Theoden hero would allow you to get Rohan allies into play quickly, which immediately made Rohan decks more effective. There was a lot of Rohan going on at the time here, with Voice of Isengard wrapping up and then this saga expansion coming out. But also got Hero Treebeard. So we just got Ally Treebeard less than a year before this. But Treebeard was a very strong hero that could make himself stronger by damaging himself, which isn't that big of a deal because a lot of Ent allies were very good at healing. This is also the first Fellowship Sphere hero that was not Frodo Baggins, as we got the first of the Fellowship Aragorn cards. And this Aragorn readied heroes like Corset Aragorn does, but you're doing so with Fellowship resources, which you really can't use to spend for many other cards, relatively speaking. The Land of Shadow, despite taking place concurrently with Treason of Saruman, was released 7 months later, so in November of 2015. This expansion would show Frodo, Sam, and Gollum first pass through the Dead Marshes, which they probably would have named that quest the Dead Marshes, if not for the fact that they already used that name for a quest. They would then cross paths with Faragorn's company.
I did 2 takes of that, and apparently I said Faragorn both times. It's Faramir. This is a long video.
And the journey to the Crossroads, followed by Shelob's Lair, who was the boss character for this expansion. Shelob, that is. You started to see some enemies from Harad, which is another nice aspect of variety. Haradrim enemies have a bit of an Arabian feel to them, which was obviously not an aesthetic applied to any enemies in the game so far. I can't totally look past the fact that that Smeagol objective ally card is very, very ugly. That's a strange looking Smeagol. Fellowship Frodo got to use Fellowship resources and exhaust the One Ring to power himself up here, which again is more of what he was doing in this phase of the story. The heroes of this box were Faramir and Damrod. Faramir and Damrod, while Gondor heroes, did really fit into traditional Gondor decks like we've seen with the Heirs of Numenor. They leaned more into Ranger decks, which went hand in hand with trap decks. The This is also a time where you were better off by buying as many expansions as possible. Just for example, if you wanted Skinbark to go with your Ents, you couldn't just get the Voice of Isengard expansions and the Treason of Saruman for that. You also needed to get the Land of Shadow. While a lot of these expansions had themes and main archetypes that they went for and main traits that they would help emphasize, there was always a mix of cards in each expansion of Lord of the Rings at this point. It was very common to have expansions have, say, one dwarf card or one end card. If you wanted to make your dwarf decks as strong as possible, you needed to buy that expansion for it. It might be silly to buy a $15 to $20 expansion for one card, or in some cases $30 expansions for the deluxe boxes. But like I mentioned in the earlier parts of this series, the Lord of the Rings card game was at its best if you had a lot of expansions, and this is partly why. Because as you added expansions to your collection, all deck types got stronger and gave you more and more options. It felt like exponential options for deck construction as each of these archetypes got built out gradually. At the same time of the release of the Treason of Saruman, you had the beginning of the 2015 cycle for Lord of the Rings, the card game. This was the Lost Realm and the Angmar Awakened cycle. For those unfamiliar, Angmar is the region to the north of Middle-earth, and the Witch King of Angmar, one of the big bads in the Lord of the Rings story, especially at the Battle of Pelennor Fields, and Weathertop for that matter, is from Angmar. It was perhaps the first truly unexplored area of Middle-earth that Lord of the Rings, the card game, would delve into. Between the saga expansions and the fact that the first few cycles of the game took place in areas very familiar to fans of the Lord of the Rings movies, Voice of Isengard, for example, is all territory you might recognize. Sure, Dunland was a little bit to the north of Isengard. Exploring Dunland, you get less of a feel for the area, more just a different variety of enemies, but seemingly in and around Rohan. Angmar, you got new types of enemies, but you also got locations that fit the theme and felt different enough from the main Lord of the Rings story that you felt like you were someplace new. The closest you get to Angmar in the main Lord of the Rings story is at Weathertop. Or if you got the fog on the Barrow Downs, that's what you got to think about for Angmar here. Angmar actually borders Arnor, which is the northern area of men that fell about 1,500 years before the time of the Lord of the Rings. So you're talking about a lot of whites and spectral, ghostly bad guys here. The quests of this cycle were difficult, but it was still a good story, and there's a reason why this was the first of the deluxe expansions and following cycles to get repackaged when the game was revived in 2022. You had objective allies like Iarion and Amarthiel. Amarthiel would follow the arc of first becoming an objective ally and eventually becoming a hero. My personal pick for my favorite expansion art is the Battle of Carn Dûm, with that art for Thardir standing on a field, on a barren field. Also happens to be one of the most difficult quests in the history of the game. So if you successfully beat that guy, you have accomplished something significant. One of my favorite quests to play, however, was actually Escape from Mount Graham, which in my opinion was an improved version of the rescue someone from the dungeons type of quest you saw with Escape from Dol Guldur in the core set. Escape from Mount Graham, you actually start with one hero, and you have to find your other heroes as you escape from the titular Mount Graham, which felt very different from other quests and is a fun, very thematic thing to add into a game. And it was nice at this point in the game's history, the designers knew how to design a quest like that. As far as player cards are concerned, this was where you started to see the Dunedain archetype. The Lost Realm featured Halbarad and Aragorn. Tactics Aragorn, that is. And that's, if you count Fellowship Aragorn, that's 4 different Aragorn cards. Although Frodo, technically, I think also had 4 heroes at this point. 3 of them, though, were Fellowship. Here you had Fellowship Aragorn, Tactics Aragorn, Lore Aragorn, and Core Set Leadership Aragorn. So Aragorn was leading in the most versions of the same hero department. The Dunedain archetype was all about engaging enemies, which fits the theme of Dunedain Rangers defending the peaceful areas in Eriador and what used to be Arnor, such as Hobbiton. You wonder how Hobbiton's able to be so peaceful? It's because these guys are taking on the enemies willingly. A few new mechanics were also revealed in this cycle. First was the mechanic of side quests. So these were player cards, and you had some encounter cards that were side quests as well. You could explore them instead of the main quest, and if you did so, you got certain bonuses. So it has a bit of that RPG type feel where you could power yourself up by going on a side quest, but unlike RPGs, when you're playing Lord of the Rings, a card game, you don't have forever to go do that. So you don't end up overpowered. You're definitely inflicting a cost by taking a turn away from the main quest, but they're very often worth it and are very fun cards. Gather Information was the first player card side quest, and side quests were something that you would see throughout the rest of the game's life. Another fun new mechanic was the idea of encounter style allies. So Ranger of the North was a card that if you played Ranger Summons, you got to put into the encounter deck. So you would actually get these guys popping out of the encounter deck. So this is, the Ranger of the North is a quite strong card. You only have to pay 1 resource for it, but you don't get to control when he shows up. but then he might come and save the day just when you need him. So which is an awesome effect. Ton of fun. The rest of the heroes of the Angmar Awakened cycle we're pulling from a variety of different archetypes. You got Mary as another version of Mary for your Hobbit decks. Dory the Dwarf. Amarthiel as another Dunedain hero. Raciel the Sylvan hero is kind of in a category by her own. You see, Raciel would use cards that go into the victory display. It was something that very specific to Raciel, and as a result you had Raciel decks were designed to get cards in the victory display, not just encounter cards. If you had an encounter card that had a victory number on it, that means when you defeated that character, you would put it in a victory display, and it wouldn't go back and get reshuffled in the encounter deck. That is something reserved for unique and big bad type of enemies. But with Raciel decks, you're able to get player cards into the victory display as well. I haven't played too much with Raciel decks. If you thought Sylvan decks were a little bit counterintuitive in how they operate, where you get bonuses just for dropping cards in and out of play, Raciel decks are going to feel very strange to you. You also had Eristor and Arwen, the Noldor heroes. Eristor and Arwen were some of the most prominent early cards of the Noldor archetype, which we'll talk about more with the Grey Havens and the Dream Chaser cycle. What you need to know now, Noldor was more about discarding cards and drawing cards, where Sylvan was more about the cards entering play and leaving play. So similar, both types of elves, but different in a few important ways. Before we move on, just one more mention here is Sword Thane. I like any cards that allow you to potentially get extra heroes in play. Sword Thane was one of the first ways you can actually do that. The 2015 Gen Con and Fellowship expansion packs were the last of the just regular old, here's another cool quest that you can go do, print-on-demand expansions. The Ruins of Belegost takes place in the Blue Mountains, which is to the west of Middle-earth. It was actually a nice precursor to the Grey Haven cycle, which takes place to the west. In this quest, you're actually hunting a dragon from Thangorodrim, which for those that read the Silmarillion know that's a prominent mountain in the history of Middle-earth. That's one of the favorite things that the Lord of the Card Game does, is when it's able to evoke things from earlier ages of Middle-earth in ways that they would be relevant in the Third Age. So I really appreciate those mentions. The Murder at the Prancing Pony was an interesting quest type because you're trying to guess who the murderer is. There's also a bit of a difficult quest, and there's also a bit of a one-off adventure like the Ruins of Belegost. In February 2016, we got the Grey Havens, which was the beginning of the Dream Chaser cycle. In the Grey Havens, players actually got to board ships in a card game. That's right. You got ships such as the Dream Chaser, and one of the mechanics you had to manage was the sailing of your ship. Your ship could be on course or off course, and whether or not it is tracked by that compass-looking card that you see there. Thematically, the cycle took you onto the seas, the Ocean of Belgair. Belgair, also known as the Great Sea, or the Sundering Seas, or the Western Sea. And you actually got to sail around the sunken ruins of Numenor, which in the Second Age of Middle-earth was plunged into the sea by Eru Ilúvatar. Such a cool way to take full advantage of the Middle-earth theme. Obviously, nothing like that happens in any Middle-earth canon, but it absolutely could happen. The entire continent of Beleriand is kind of under the water too. So it's an interesting thing to do that kind of shows instead of tells how much there is to Middle-earth without directly violating any aspect of the story that might have been written down by Tolkien. I guess if they gave the Rings of Power treatment to it, they could have screwed it up, but they didn't. Along with being able to sail on a boat, you would have sailing tests. Tests were secondary types of little mini quests, mini challenges you had to meet throughout the course of the quest. These tests existed even early in the game's life in the Shadows of Mirkwood cycle with, say, escape tests and Gollum. This mechanic would not go away. This cycle, the designers got a lot of experience with that type of mechanic, and we're about to see why. I will say, especially from a quest standpoint, the Dream Chaser cycle was the absolute peak of Lord of the Rings, the card game. My favorite quest from the cycle was the
Temple of the Deceived,
where you were actually exploring ruins. So you used cards to create an area where you could actually move from location to location as if you had set up a board. This is something that the game hadn't really done before. Well, it was the game's best attempt at giving you a bit of a board to play with, which is, boards are great just for immersion. One complaint people have about thematic card games is that you're just always playing a card game. At least with a board game, you kind of see what's going on a little bit better. Card game, you're doing a lot more with the board in your mind. Because at the Dream Chaser, adding the memorable characters like Naasia and Captain Sahir, we're talking about the absolute peak of Lord of the Rings, the card game. As far as player cards, you got the two Noldor heroes out of the Grey Havens. You had Círdan, the shipwright. Círdan, the owner of Narya, the third of the Rings of Power. We now have all 3 Rings of Power, and Narya actually could be attached to Círdan or to Gandalf, as Gandalf actually has that ring in the Lord of the Rings. I had a lot of Noldor allies that were all about discarding cards, card draw, playing cards from your discard pile. That's what the Noldor elves do. You did get bits and pieces of other archetypes. You had some Gondor cards. You had the second version of hero Prince Imrahil, and the second version of hero Denethor. You had Landwyn as one of the first Dale heroes. They would come into play a little bit later. Hero Elfhelm of Rohan, and Argalad, the Sylvan Elf. Now, Assia, the Corsair, was one of those characters that began as an objective ally and then became a hero later in the cycle. But she never really got a deck archetype built around here.
Warriors, come out to play. Warriors, come out to play.
It's still a cool thing to see thematically. By this point, Rohan decks were heavily utilizing mounts, and Elfhelm leaned into that. As anytime you attached a mount to one of your heroes, if you had Elfhelm, that mount came with additional bonuses. Fits with Rohan, because Rohan, they love their horses. But there was also another notable release in 2016. I'm not even getting to the fact that actually the next cycle technically began in late 2016 instead of early 2017. See, right when the Lord of the Card game was reaching its peak with the Dream Chaser cycle, the first true competitor to the Lord of the Card game was released.